Thank you, Jeff, for getting us started. I was not a good steward of my time this morning. We have been, over this summer, looking at the topic of, making sure I don't stink, everybody's kind of pushed back a little bit. We've been looking at the topic of stewardship, and we've talked a lot about stewardship of our resources, what does it mean to be a steward, stewardship of our resources, stewardship of our time, stewardship of our sharing of other things, and stewardship, obviously, a lot of talk, especially the past few weeks, of stewardship of that we've been blessed with, stewardship of our riches and our blessings, and what that means. There's a lot of overlapping discussions there, but this morning we're going to be looking at specifically budgeting, saving, and investing. And spoiler alert, there is no scripture that kind of lays out 10% here, 20% here, 30% here, right? So what we're going to look at this morning are general principles that we should keep in mind when we're making decisions about saving, investing, and budgeting, and just some of those ideas that we want to have in mind. And then on Wednesday, we'll look at a little bit more practical advice and a little bit more, maybe a few more suggestions on specific things to do. But I want to get the principles set this morning because I don't think that, we're not going to be able to tell you, hey, you need to spend this much for entertainment and this much for giving and this much for food and shelter, right? That's not what this is. This class is to help us get our mind straight and our mind right on how do we prioritize those things and what do we think about? So a little thought question. Stacey and I like to take little road trips, and we were in Florida driving one day, and we were kind of over on the far coast and driving along the coast, and we were driving along all these houses on Palm Beach, and I mean the big houses, right? We were on that. There was one piece. We were driving. And the houses were on the right, and the ocean was on the left. And we were just looking up, and these houses were so big you really couldn't even see them because they've all got big gates and big fences, and all you can really see were the tops of them. And then yesterday, we actually were up at Lake Michigan, and on the way back, we drove along Lakeshore Drive there, around between Michigan City and New Buffalo, or that area through there. Those houses you can see, right? Those are just beautiful houses that are up, overlooking the ocean. They've got their own, there's no parking, right? It's private beach access, so all these people have their own private beach access. And my thought question is, if you've watched the news, a few days ago, somebody won over $1 billion in the lottery, right? I'm not advocating playing the lottery, but somebody won over $1 billion. How would that change your life, right? You thought about, and we've done this. Stacey and I would drive through and see a billboard, and the lottery's up to $500 million as we're driving. Like, what would you spend $500 million on? The most common thing I hear is, well, first off, I'd pay off all my debts, and then I'd pay off all my family's debts, and then, I would pay for a really nice vacation for all of the family, right? And most people I talk to, it's not a selfish, like, I'm going to move here and take this vacation. It's, I'm going to pay for a really nice vacation. I'm going to bring all my family with me, and we're going to pay for, we're going to have nice accommodation, nice experiences, whatever that is for you. And then the people start talking about, and then also I would set aside money for, my kids' college and my grandkids' college and my nieces and nephews' colleges and start setting that up. And then people start thinking about, well, maybe I would build a house, or maybe I would build, or have 2 or 3 houses and talk about where you put those houses, or maybe you want one big house. So that's the conversation of, when you have a windfall like that. And we've even, and even maybe it's not even the lottery. Maybe it's you're not even thinking about it, but you've got the next great gadget, right? You come up with the next great gadget, and it takes off and goes viral, and the next thing you know, you've got a company that's worth billions of dollars, and it happens suddenly. How would that change your perspective and your priorities? Any thoughts on that, or would it? Sorry, Bill.
You would have cousins that you've never heard of.
Right. You would have a lot of, you'd have a lot of cousins and family members that you'd never, distant cousins you've never heard of before. Any other thoughts on that?
Probably botching this quote, and I don't remember who it came from, so I reversed it, but something to the effect of, money doesn't change people, it just amplifies like who they are. So someone who is naturally generous, given, an exceptional amount of money, would continue to be generous with
Mm-hmm.
God because they were generous with us. And in the same way, somebody who would choose to be, and then would be like selfish, would continue to, use their money in selfish ways versus, being generous just because they had more money, they would continue to be themselves just more. So.
Right, and I think that's a great point, and I had that same quote in mind. I don't think he originated it, but the first time I heard it was the great philosopher Will Smith was in an interview one time, and he said that money is just an amplifier. That if you are already sad and miserable, money is just going to make you find new ways to be sad and miserable. If you're happy and generous and giving, money is just going to give you more opportunity for that, right? So I have not tested out that theory. John?
One thing I wouldn't do, you mentioned, and most people say they would, is pay off all my kids' debt. And I would be willing to help if they needed it. But I think, from my own experience, going through those struggles, I grew in my faith every time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think to take everybody's troubles away is not necessarily a good thing to do.
That's a good point. John said he wouldn't help out his kids very much. That they're on their own. No, John was saying that for those that couldn't hear that, going through some of those financial struggles and troubles and managing debts is a good exercise, and it's good. And my overall point that I want to get to is what we said, right? That if you suddenly have a lot of wealth, or you find yourself in that shouldn't. Hopefully that doesn't change your priorities, right? And that's what we want to get in mind is there are certain principles for investing, saving, budgeting that we should have today, whether we're barely making it as a short order cook at a local dive restaurant, or whether we own a chain of dive restaurants, right? That if your priorities are straight and intact, that shouldn't change as your financial situation changes. So obviously with greater wealth probably becomes more resources, and like we've talked about, some of the stresses and things like that become less, but some of the other temptations become more. So there's Proverbs 13:11 says, "Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it." So that exercise, that little mental exercise of what would you do if you suddenly had all this money, right? That's a fun little mental exercise. But really what we want to look at is whatever we have, wherever we are, how do we make sure that honors God and that we're doing the right things with that? Going back to the very beginning. I don't know why I'm flipping there. I know this passage. Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very first thing that was said, the very first verse, that sets the table right away that everything we have is God's to begin with. And if we are, at our job, if you've got any responsibility at all, whether it's making sure that, dishes are set correctly, or whether it's making sure that the company's money is spent properly, regardless, it's not your money, right? When I make decisions at work, if I decide to spend money taking somebody out for lunch, or if I buy something, a resource, or if I'm spending money on this, or even, if our company is investing in a certain area to build out a certain area, that's not my money. And whoever signs off on that, that's not actually their money. They're just being good stewards of that, and they're not the ones who came up with it. So everything that we have, and we've talked a lot about this, everything that we have was God's, is God's, and we're just stewarding it. So it's our responsibility to do so in a way that honors Him. Psalms 24:1, and just as a reminder, I typically am reading from the ESV. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, and for He has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. And in Psalm 50, for every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. So, we've talked a lot about this, that we're starting with, it's all God's, and we're just here to steward it, and it's on us to be as wise with it and responsible with it if we can. I don't want to repeat the past several weeks, but we've talked a lot about honoring God with our finances and our resources. Just call out, what are some of those principles that we should keep in mind, right? We're not going to rehash the entire past few weeks, but what are just some of the principles and godly principles that we should keep in mind when we're trying to honor God with our finances? It's like a pop quiz on the rest of the classes that we've had. Steve? Trusting in God, not in wealth. Steve?
The first fruits principle.
The what?
The first fruits principle.
The first fruits principles. What else? Steve? More than Steve can answer, right? You don't have to be Steve to answer the question. Steve?
In everything, be grateful.
In everything, be grateful, right? And even some of just the basic, right? Honesty, integrity, sharing with others, loving others, all these basic principles that we've talked about, all of this needs to come into how we think about managing and budgeting and investing, all these things, right? All these biblical principles need to come in there. Look, if you will, at Proverbs 21. Well, you don't have to turn there. It's going to be a really short passage. The plans of Proverbs 21:5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. And then just a few passages over Proverbs 27. Know well the condition of your flocks and give attention to your herds, for riches do not last forever. And does a crown endure for all generations? When the grass is gone and the new growth appears and the vegetation of the mountains is gathered, the lambs will provide your clothing and the goats of the field and the goats the price of a field. There will be enough goat's milk for your food and the food of your household and maintenance for your girls. And then Luke 16:10 says, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? And the principle here that he's talking about, he's using an analogy, but his jump-off point, right? He's talking about, hey, if you're responsible in a few things, you'll be responsible in more things. But his jump-off point is, if you're not taking care of the riches that you have or the wealth that you have, you're not going to be responsible with more. So he's making a broader point, but his jump-off point is, if you can't manage a little, you're not going to be able to manage a lot. So those are some of the principles I want us to keep in mind. Again, we're not going to rehash the whole class, but that's some of the principles we keep in mind as we're talking through all this. Stephen?
I think it's worth mentioning to be willing to share.
To be willing to share?
It's like as far as things that need to be mentioned over the last classes, that we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, the willingness to share, the willingness to help others, the willingness to help brothers out, put others first, the willingness to give first to God. What else? Anybody else have anything they want to? All right. So those are the principles. Those are some of the basic principles. What does the Bible say about saving and preparing for the future? Look at Luke 12. Luke 12 is the parable of the rich fool, and someone in the crowd said to him, starting in verse 13, someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to him, Man, who made me judge or arbitrator over you? And he said to them, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, What shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store up all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Is this passage telling us that we shouldn't be saving and thinking about the future? No. What is this passage saying? What's the difference between this passage versus saving?
Depends on what your life consists of.
Depends on what your life consists of, depends on what your end goal is, right? I think the key verses here are, or the key phrase here, he said to himself, I will relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And, it was his end goal, right? He wasn't putting up to make sure that he could provide for himself. He was taking advantage of his abundance, not sharing it, and he was thinking about, how can I live? How can I have a bigger house? How can I relax? Steve, I think you had your hand up or started. Yeah.
Yeah, the terms here, I, me, and mine are the difference.
Right. Steve said the terms I, me, and my are what really set this verse apart. As a contrast, look at Proverbs 6. And starting in verse 6, it's, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. So that proverb shows us that there's some wisdom to planning ahead. And then the story that I really think of, and we're going to read not all of this, but look, if you will, at Genesis 41. I think this is one of the best examples that we have of planning ahead. And as a backdrop, this is the story of Joseph. Joseph has the power of dream interpretation. He's been put in jail by his previous employer falsely. While in jail, he meets a couple of guys and he interprets their dreams. One of them ends back up in Pharaoh's court. And Pharaoh has a dream, and he needs it interpreted. So starting in verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret the answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as the beginning. Then I awoke and also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And as I told it to the magicians, and there was no one that could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after that there will be 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown to the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select and be discerning wise man, and let him set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be reserved for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So as we read ahead a little bit, Pharaoh likes what he hears, ends up putting Joseph in charge of all this. And then down in 46, he says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh the king. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. And during the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city in the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. And then skipping down to 53, the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt soon came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said, and there was famine in all the lands. But in the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, and the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, Pharaoh said to all of the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famines were severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So what can we learn from this passage? What wisdom do we see here? John?
I think in trying to apply this to our lives today and being old enough to see how the economy cycles, that we have a tendency when things are good financially to go out and buy more things. And until we see that cycle come around a couple of times where, I don't care what business you're in or job, it will affect the whole economy. And so we learn that we should put some back when things are good, because there's going to be some lean years.
Right.
And so I think, although we don't have these dreams of 7 years, I think we should learn from this before we go through those cycles.
Absolutely. So, 1 second, Mark. So what John said was that, we see this principle, and often we have such goldfish memories, right, where we're only remembering the past few minutes. And, if times are good, we want to live, we think they're always going to be good, right? I've got a job, I've got lots of money, I'm being paid well, it's going to be like this forever, right? Likewise, we sometimes do it the other way, right? If we're in a dire situation, or if we're in bad times, we think, oh, this is never going to end, it's never going to get any better, what's the use? But John's point is that, what we see here is definitely the example of when things are plenty, when things are good, remember it's not always going to be that way, and set aside some. Don't make those big giant purchases, don't go overboard, and plan for the future, plan for when times may not be as well. Mark?
Start off with the old phrase of idle hands or the devil's workshop. Might not sound like it ties in initially, but I want to look at both these passages. We're going back and forth between them, the parable that you just referenced and then the scenario here. In both scenarios, they're storing up, as John was mentioning, storing up for those times. I think one of the major differences is they were storing up against hard times.
Right.
With the intent of continuing to work through there. Whereas the indication in the parable seems to be more of he was laying it up so he could kick back and relax and not have to worry about anything. Regardless of how generous he was or wasn't, the intent seemed to be more one of him not working at that point. And as we've seen in some of our previous studies talking about time and everything else, work is something that we were meant for and meant to do. Rest is in there. We definitely don't need to just be working so hard that we never get a chance to actually rest and recuperate some of that. But at the same time, if our only focus is then on getting to that point, quote unquote, of indefinite relaxation, then there's a different set of issues that needs to be addressed where the heart is concerned, because we're not being intentional on continuing to do the work that God intended for us to do.
Right. So, paraphrase Mark, I'm kind of bringing in Steve's comment from a moment ago as well, right? The difference is the me and the I, right? In the parable, the rich man was, I'm going to save this up so that I don't have to work, I can relax. What we see here in this story is putting aside so that people will be able to eat, putting aside of the abundance, and that principle that, there was never any indication that they were going to stop working, like Mark said, that they were still going to work through and keep trying, but and keep maintaining a lifestyle. But they weren't looking to, hey, let's store up all this grain so that in 7 years we can kick back and relax, right? We definitely see the principle of saving to help saving in advance just for the lean time to even out the times, I guess is what I'm trying to say. See another hand or any thoughts there? Scott?
Mark referenced the last two passages, the parable and then this story about Joseph. And in the parable, it seems like he's just so self-centered. He reads the word I like 6 or 7 times.
Right.
Self-centered, very worried about himself.
Yeah, Joseph was preparing, Joseph had everybody else in mind, and even Pharaoh, they had everybody else in mind as they were saving versus the rich man. Ally?
I mean, obviously, Joseph knows where everything comes from.
Right.
There's no question he's got a foundation for, the parable that I feel like is, maybe there's fear driving that, is I want to make sure I'm protecting my own and taking care of myself. And selfishness is that, but I feel like fear is underneath there. You don't know where it's coming from. You have to control it because somebody else is going to take care of you. That's not a God principle. And Joseph knew that no matter where he was, that God was underneath all of it.
Yeah, so to paraphrase Natalie, she said Joseph seemed to have a better understanding or a much better grasp of where everything was coming from, and that underneath this all, the foundation was God. Versus the rich man, it was his stuff, his savings, his barns he was going to tear down, and his bigger barns. Where Joseph had a clear understanding, or seemed to have a clear understanding, the plenty is because of God, and and even the lean times were even when they were lean times, it was still God's to begin with. So, John.
This probably gets more into your Wednesday night things, but it seemed like it's a good place to put in a point of reminder, is that this required budgeting.
Mm-hmm.
Like with Pharaoh and Joseph, I mean, there had to be some accounting of what we have and where we need to be. And I think that's a good godly principle, even with the ants preparing in summer for the winter.
Right.
We have to account, as you mentioned, the ups and downs or John, the ups and downs of the economy and so forth. And I ran across someone just recently that they had no idea of how much money was in their checkbook because they never balanced it. And, how can we be good stewards of what we don't know what we have?
Right.
So, and I'm not saying it to be harsh or critical, but this may be a good time for us to assess, how accountable am I being, and am I planning, for these things? And it does require planning, and it requires some structure in how we do things. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and John said that this took planning and forethought, right? That Joseph set out ahead of time 20% off the top, or 1/5. That's 20%. Thank you. I wasn't planning on doing math in this sermon, but for this lesson, that he took 20% off the top, and it was not, it wasn't 20-ish%. It wasn't 20% most months, but it was 20%, and he was pretty fanatic about it as he went through the land and took it from everywhere and saved it up. So, Mary.
Express this. Another aspect, not just in terms of saving money in preparation, but in culture. There is a show that I like to watch, it's called Living Below Zero. It's subsistence living in Alaska. And their culture prepares for bad times. It prepares for the elderly by having a culture where the young are raised that go out, you've got your first fruits, you've got these things. You make sure that the elderly that can't go out anymore are taken care of. And that too is a preparation for old age and our attitudes of taking care of those who have gone before, those who have taken care of us and taught us. And I just have really appreciated their respect and honor, and that they feel a responsibility to take care of those. And it's just a part of their culture, it's a part of their faith.
And so Mary was saying that it's not just, it's not just saving things and saving money, but it's also as part of that saving for maybe the elderly or those that need more help, that can't go out and work as much, or can't go out and work anymore. So it's that planning for the future, and planning to help others. I want to move on and talk briefly. The clock is broken. It's spinning faster than I thought it would. I want to look at it. So we've talked about saving, right? And I think we clearly see that there is a foundation for responsible saving and putting aside for future times that may not be as prosperous, and also as part of that, as John said, being responsible with purchases and not just blowing it all as soon as you get it, but saving in it for the future. Talk a little bit about investing. We have a few examples of investing and the idea of investing. Look, if you will, at Matthew 25. Matthew 25, starting in verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. And he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with him. And those who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I've made you 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also went to the one who had 2 talents. The one who had 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you had to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him and said, You wicked and slothful servant, you know that I reap where I do not sow, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was with my own interest. So take the talent and he took the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has more will be given, and he will be given abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And he cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, into that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And again, I think it's making a wider point here, but his jump-off point here is this idea of investing, right? And I don't think the lesson here is go out and make sure that you're investing so that you double your income. I think what we see is the idea that investing is okay and is good, and it was a wise use of the resources, and that was his starting point. Proverbs 16:11 says, A just balance and scales are the Lord's, all the weights in the bag are his work. And then Proverbs 22:1 says, A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. The rich and the poor meet together, the Lord is the maker of them all. From these passages, what can we discern about investing and the way that we should invest? So from these passages, I think what we can discern is that investing is okay, wise investments is good, but if we pull back in these other principles that we talked about honesty, integrity, sharing, we see that our investments need to be wise and honoring God. So I'm going to throw out some examples, right? If you are investing in a scheme that you know is very likely to take advantage of others, whether they're your brothers or sisters or even others, right? That if you're investing in something where it's a zero sum and everything I gain is going to be something that they lose, and I'm taking money from them, and I'm thinking of like if you think of some of the big pyramid, what was his name? The guy that scammed a lot of people, Bernie. Madoff. Yeah, Bernie Madoff, right? Where he was taking the money and clearly kind of doing a shell game and cheating others, right? That mentality, and that's an extreme example, but even that might even be something that we're tempted to do, right? If you're trying to invest in something that you know is going to take advantage of others, that's a principle that I think we need to keep in mind, that's not honoring God with our finances. You know, if we're investing in things that are displeasing to God, and I'm not going to, you know, if there's a company or an organization that you're investing in that's making a lot of money and making a lot of income and is a good return on investment, but the primary thing that company or that organization is focused on is not honoring God, or is even against what God wants from us, that's something you need to think about. I don't think that's something that we should be investing in and spending our resources on. Scott, I know you started to raise your hand. Have you still got a point, or yeah?
When I read this passage you just read to us, I'm made to think about the fear that the first person had, the person with one talent. The fear of doing something wrong dictated his decisions.
Right.
And I just wonder if we don't get into some of the same kind of thing. We're afraid to put money in the stock market or something because we're afraid that it might fail, or afraid that God might not be happy with it. I just wonder a little bit about this element of fear related to this parable, and how does it affect us even today?
That's an interesting point. I don't know that I can answer that exactly, but it's definitely something to ponder about, right? How does that element of fear, and I get, you know, it goes to his wider point, right? I don't think his point was, you know, make sure that you invest as wisely and you know, maximize your income, but that idea of doing nothing and being timid and not wanting to do anything when God is clearly, you know, wanting us to do something, that you know, that fear of not succeeding and that fear of failing was holding him back. John?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think
I hear a but.
there is a slight difference between aggressive investments and godly investments. Just to go back to Joseph. I mean, when Joseph saved up, I mean, he was investing that because later on he basically used that to buy all of Egypt. I mean, he made slaves, took all their money, took all their cattle, he took all their land, and basically themselves. And so when you say taking advantage, that sounds like taking advantage. But yes, Joseph seems to have the blessing of God to do that. So, while at the same time I think that we need to act rightly, honestly, at the same time, there are some true business tactics that we need to be aware of. That one, are going to be using against us, but two, you know, is that godly to use it? Since Joseph seems to be using it in this case, where is that divided?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you right there. I'm not saying that aggressive investments are wrong. What my point is, we need to think about where we're investing, right? So if you are knowingly taking advantage of other people, and I don't think Joseph was taking advantage of other people. He was setting aside, maybe it was a forced taking aside, but it was for the greater good, right? But if your mindset is, I'm going to get this no matter who gets hurt, or if you've got blinders on and you don't, you know, and you realize that your other people are being hurt or being taken advantage of, and when I mean taken advantage of, I mean not for their greater good. I mean for, you know, they're going to end up on the wrong side of it, right? And you're going to reap the benefits of that. I think that those are some of the principles we need to talk about. There's plenty of investments out there and plenty of opportunity to grow that without taking advantage and hurting others. Dan?
I think it goes back to your intent, because with aggressive investing, which I've been guilty of doing in the past, when I was at Subaru, I invested in the most risky and aggressive international funds that they would allow us to.
Right.
Because I made more money, and it was I made more money. It wasn't anything else. So it's your perspective, it's your intent, and usually an aggressive fund or an aggressive investment has a bigger return. But it's inherently not safe.
Right. And look, I'm not about to stand up here and draw a line and say what's okay and what's not okay. But to your point, right, you know, a lot of wise investment counsel will say, if you're going to be risky when you're younger and you've got more time to recover. it's not a great idea to invest your life savings in lottery tickets on your, right before you're about to retire, right? So you can tolerate, when it comes to being aggressive like that, you can tolerate a little bit more risk when you're young. I don't think it's wrong to be aggressive when you're older. You just have to be wise about it. Just sparked a bunch of hands. Stephen?
Probably could talk a half hour on all the stuff I want to say right now, but I would just ask one question to maybe help us all think. And that question is, what would kingdom investing look like? I've got a whole lot of other things that I'd like to say about what you mentioned as far as where you put your money or what you should be cautious of in investing in various companies and whatnot. But just, what does kingdom investing look like?
What does kingdom investment look like?
Is that even a thing? Is all the stuff that's talked about supposed to point our heart towards something beyond the physical?
Right.
That's all I should do this way.
All right, we are out of time. If you've got an additional comment. So Wednesday, I plan on maybe looking a little bit more practical and some, like I said, I'm not going to give anybody specific answers, but we'll look at some guidelines and some practical advice on things like this, and maybe some examples that we can pull from. But if you've got other comments and you want it, we'll spend a few minutes coming back and circling back. So if you get some more comments, catch me after class, or we can talk about it in the next